All right, here we go. Any questions from last night's homework? Two circle graphs. A couple people said that they didn't have a protractor, so I said, take your best guess at the angles. You have to be able to calculate the angles, but you don't have a protractor. Obviously, you had to estimate what that would look like. All right, we are on Friday, so Friday schedule. So we're gonna do 2 days of this. 2 days of this. I will introduce almost all the concepts today. There's four of them. I just don't have enough time to do all four of them, so I'm gonna do three of them, and then the fourth one will be on Monday. So Monday will be a repeat of what we learned today with our fourth and final measure. All right, here is your homework. Notice that the instructions say just the mean and the median, right? On Monday, we'll do all four. This will make more sense after the class. But I just want you, for 2 through 14 evens, I just want you to calculate the mean and the median, the mean and the median. Page 414, 2 through 14 evens. The instructions will say a lot of things. I just want you to calculate the mean and the median. And by the end of the class, you will know what that means, pun intended. All right, here we go. There are four things here: mean, median, mode, and range. By Monday, you'll calculate all four of them, but for today, we're just going to do them. We're going to do three of them today, but I will only have you for homework do the mean, the median.
Oh, I think I've done this before.
Yeah, many of you will have done this before. Remember the last few classes we've been talking about data, and although I've told you before, data is both numerical and non-numerical, at least this year, you're not going to see non-numerical data. So we're only going to see numerical data for this year. Oftentimes with data, you're asked to find the average of those numbers if it's numerical data. Averages is kind of a tricky word. Now, although in common usage, we do use the word average, mathematically speaking, we don't use the word average. We use mean, median, and mode. All right. So if I ask you to figure out the average number of students in each class, or I ask you to find the most common price for a house that's sold in Colorado Springs, or if I ask you the most frequently used jersey number for quarterbacks in the NFL, I am asking you to find, well, in everyday common speak, an average. Literally, question number one there, or statement number one, says to do an average, but those other two are averages each way. What is the average price for a house in Colorado Springs? What is the average jersey number in the NFL for quarterbacks? Those are all averages, and each one of these three examples right here is actually done differently. So using the word average, yeah, in everyday common life, you're going to use the word average, but mathematically speaking is three different ideas, and that's what today's class and Monday's class is about. All three of those are called measures of central tendency. In your notes, please. These are mathematical methods to show averages, or the middle of the data. So when you're trying to find an average, you're trying to find where's the middle of the data. What number is smack dab in the middle? There's three of them, mathematically speaking. You ask the average person on the street, what's an average? They would probably only recognize one of the three, even though there's technically three of these. Measures of central tendency, there's three of them. Mathematical methods to show averages, or the middle of the data. And as always, you're going to have to stop me if I'm going too quickly. I'm moving on. All right, quick note, there are three. Okay, I've said this a bunch of times. So this year and next year, I shouldn't say next year, this should say Monday, not next year. Monday, you will do the mode as well, too. All right, we are going to be dealing with a big fancy word for a bunch of numbers all put together. And those numbers all put together are called a data set. Okay, so if I gather some data, how tall are you, right? I ask every person in the class, how tall are you? If I record those answers, I'm making what's called a data set. So this is numerical information about a topic. Hey, how tall are you? Write that number down. Go to the next person. How tall are you? Write that number down. At the very end there, you're going to have a whole bunch of numbers. That's called a data set. Not too challenging to understand what's going on. So here's a data set. Now, I'm not going to tell you what this one is about. It's just some random numbers put together. So there is a data set. It'll be numbers that are separated by commas typically. They can be written different ways. They can be written vertically, horizontally, and it's really up to the writer of the data how they want to present that data. All right, we are trying to find averages, and I said there were 3 of these. So if I ask you to find the average of these 3 numbers, most people, if I ask you to calculate the average, they're thinking about this. And now this is the mathematical term. We're trying to find the exact middle of those numbers. We call that the MEAN, the mean. It divides the data into 2 equal parts. The answer may or may not be in the data set, meaning that if I give you a string of numbers and you do this calculation, and you'll do here in a second, called the mean, and you find out the answer is 10.1, 10.1 may not be one of those numbers in the data set. The mean is typically when someone says, hey, what is the average on bat percentage of a baseball player in the Major League Baseball, they are usually asking you to calculate a mean. They won't say calculate the mean. They'll say, give me the average. What's the average height of a person in period 1? Right? That's what you would be doing when you would be calculating a mean. So why don't we call it a mean? Well, the world's not mathematically inclined. But for mathematicians, the average doesn't have has a good meaning. However, mean has a specific meaning, and it's defined by a formula that we'll talk about here in a second. And most of you probably know this formula. All right, so mean is the exact middle of the data. So there are steps to calculate. This is the part that you need to write down. There are steps to calculate them. If you've already done this before, well, it's going to be intuitive. If you've never calculated a mean before, well, make sure you write down the steps. So let's see, how do you calculate a mean? So step 1 is you take all the numbers of the data set and you add them. All right, so we're already adding a whole bunch of numbers. Tonight for homework, I'm not going to give you 50 numbers to add, but I could give you 10 numbers to add. So you're going to add up all the numbers. That's step 1. Step number 2 is you count how many numbers are in the data set. Literally, there's 1 number, 2 number, 3 number. You count how many numbers in the number set. And then step number 3, the painful step is you divide step number 1 by step number 2. In other words, you divide the sum of all the numbers in the data set by how many numbers there are. And for those of you who have done an average, generally, or a mean, generally this is used, let's see, in your life, hey, what's my grade point average? Literally grade point average, right? You take all your grades, you add them up and divide by how many grades you have. Hey, what's my average in my class, Mr. C? Well, how do you do that by hand? Well, you take all your test grades, you add them up and divide by how many tests there were. Of the 3 measures of central tendency, this is the most common one, the mean. And like I said, it's what most people mean, pun intended, when they say, hey, what's the average? Step 1, step 2, step 3. Step 1, add up all the numbers. Step 2, count the numbers. Step 3, divide step 1 by step 2. Now, for class purposes, I'm going to do the math very quickly. I want us to focus on the process, not the actual adding and dividing part. But you're going to have to do that, obviously, for homework. But we're going to concentrate on the procedures. If there's questions on the procedures, make sure you ask them. But no, I'm not going to spend time adding 20 numbers together. All right, we good to go? All right, so here's an example. So here's my data set. It's the one that we had before. And we're supposed to calculate the mean. Well, step number 1 is we add up all the numbers. So we literally have to take all of those numbers and add them up. So I take all those numbers and add them up. Step number 2 says to count the numbers. And here's what I mean if you were confused by that. Count the numbers. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's 9 numbers. So I count the numbers. Step number 2 is you count the numbers. Step number 1, you add up all the numbers. Step number 2, you count them, and you can kind of see what I'm going for here. I wrote a fraction because step number 3 is you divide the top by the bottom. The top was the sum of all the numbers. The bottom is the count of all the numbers, and yeah, you have to do that work. As I said before, I'm not going to spend much time on actually physically doing the adding and dividing. We're just talking about the procedure. If I add up all those numbers, I get 108. I divide 108 by 9. Yes, you may use your calculator. You don't need it for that particular one. And you get a mean of 12. Notice I have the word there, mean. If you say the answer is 12, I don't know if you calculated the mean, the median, or the mode. We're going to be doing all 3 of those today. So make sure you put what you were calculating. I was calculating the mean there. Once again, the procedures are add up all the numbers in your data set, count the numbers, and then divide the sum of all the numbers by the count, and that is your mean. Now, your mean could be a decimal number. It could be repeating. You might have to round. It could be a nice friendly number like 12 was this time. It could be anywhere in between. All right, so let's do one. So I didn't give you, 10 numbers. I've only given you 5 numbers. So we will do this one, the whole process by hand. Step number 1, we're supposed to add up all the numbers. So, we're going to need obviously some scratch work. So we're going to have a 23 and a 14, and I'm going to add these, so I'm writing them vertically, an 18, a 28, and a 25. All right, let's see. Quickly, 5 plus 8 is 13, plus 8 is 21, plus 4 is 25, plus 3, 28. So I get 28, so 8 carrier 2. 2 plus 2 is 4, 5, 6, 8, 10. So I'm getting 108. 108. So I add up all those numbers, I get 108. Step number 2 says to count how many numbers we have. So we have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have 108 over 5, and step number 3 says, yep, you guessed it, do the long division. So 108, that's the sum of all the numbers in the data set, divided by 5. 5 is the number of numbers in the data set, and it's simply a little bit of a long division here. Ooh, nice friendly numbers. 5 goes into 10 2 times, 0 left over, bring down my 8. 5 goes into 8 once. With 3 left over, need to add a decimal place and a 0. Notice I always put my decimal place immediately to the top so I don't forget it. And we get a 6, so I got a 21.6, and we're done. Yes, I chose a nice, easy, friendly one to do by hand. As I said, you can get a decimal number, you can get a whole number, you can get a repeating decimal, you can get a terminating decimal, anything in between. Remember those things that I said at the start when calculating the mean. Notice that in this particular case, the answer is not one of our numbers. Like the answer to the mean question is not in our data set. So we're saying the middle of all the numbers is 21.6. What does that mean? If I were to write the numbers from least to greatest, 14, let's see, 18, and it would go 23, 25, 28. I'm not putting commas here. Well, 21.6 would be somewhere right here. And you're like, well, how is that the middle of the data, right? Well, that is your average. So you got some high scores, but unfortunately, you got a really low score of 14, and that's what drags the average down. And that is why when you get a really low F on a test, it takes a whole bunch of really high scores to drag your average back to an acceptable, grade. If you get a B and you get a really low F, because remember B's are a small range, only from 80 to 89, but F's go from 60 all the way down to 0. You get a 10 on a test, even though you have a B, you need a bunch of more solid scores to make sure that you don't fail the class. And that's kind of the tyranny of the numbers right there when you're calculating the mean. All right.
I have a
I'm
question.
not going to do individually. I'm not going to show you the individual math. I'll just show you the steps. So we have a data set. Step number 1 is we add up all the data. Step number 2 is we count the data. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 6 numbers here. And then step number 3 is we divide the sum of the numbers, in this case 142 by 6. This one's a repeating decimal, so we will have to round. You may or may not have to round tonight for homework, but if you do, round to the nearest tenth, please, to the nearest tenth. All right, any questions on calculating the mean?
I have a question.
Sure.
Can the mean be like a negative number?
It can if there are negative numbers in your data set. So for
Okay.
instance, if our data set included negative numbers, it is entirely possible that your answer could be negative. All right, well, imagine that. It's the very next question. So what happens when there's negative numbers involved? Well, the only step you got to be careful with is to add the numbers, and I will do this one by hand. So if we add these numbers, we go from left to right. Remember PEMDAS. 0 plus 1 is 1. 1 plus 3 is 4. 4 minus 4 is 0. 0 plus 4 is 4. 4 minus 6 is negative 2. But negative 2 plus 7 is 5. All right, we didn't get a negative number here, but we did get a smaller number, 5. And what? There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 7 numbers. So that would be 5 divided by 7. You can either leave that as a fraction or you can change it to a decimal, your choice. All right, that does it for mean. Any question?
Nope.
Cool. So I said we're going to do 3 of these today. We just did the first one, mean. And like I said, I would be surprised if you can get to 7th grade without ever having done the mean before, although you may have forgotten how to do it. Let's talk about house prices in Colorado Springs. If you buy a house in Colorado Springs, I don't know, maybe you spend $250,000, maybe you spend $400,000, maybe you spend $6 million. There are some $6 million houses. Very few of them, though. Well, think about what would happen if we exclude that $6 million house, and if we do the average here, the mean, right? If we calculate the mean of these numbers, okay, great. That would be important information for telling someone moving to Colorado Springs about what an average house cost. The issue is that as soon as we add that one house in Colorado Springs that costs $6 million, it drags the average way closer to 6 million. Right? And if you add up all those numbers and divide, you're going to get an average house price of over $1 million. And we know that most houses in Colorado Springs don't cost $1 million. So this is the issue, mathematically speaking, of averages. Right? If I ask you to calculate the average price of a house sold in Colorado Springs, and you put that number 6 million in there, you don't get what you're looking for. You get a number that is technically mathematically correct. It is the mean, but boy, it gives the false impression. No one would move to Colorado Springs if they said, hey, the average house price is $1 million. So we have a way of handling this, mathematically speaking, and that is called the mean. Oh, by the way, here is the mean of those numbers, right? We have a method of dealing with this. In fact, if you look at the average house price, they usually have a different word instead of average. They usually use the word the median house price. And that's the next one. The median house price is literally not the middle of the data, but the middle number, literally the middle number. What medians do is it takes the numbers of your data set, puts them in order from least to greatest, and then finds the middle number. And if your data set is large enough, right, there's lots of houses sold in Colorado Springs, then you actually find out what is the average house price the average price of a house that's sold in Colorado Springs. The mean would give you a very, we call in mathematical terms, we call it a skewed number. It gives you a number that is really affected by either really cheap houses or really expensive houses. What a median does is it gets rid of those numbers that give us issues. That bottom statement right there, it's useful when you have weird numbers. Weird numbers are called outliers, numbers that are very different from all the other numbers in your data set. The middle one also says that the median may or may not be a number in your data set. The mean usually is never a number in your data set, but the median, most of the time, it is a number in your data set. I shouldn't say most of the time. Maybe half the time it's a number in your data set. All right, so now we're going to show you how to calculate the median. So we had procedures for calculating the mean. We're going to have procedures for calculating the median. In 7th grade, you will only ever be asked to calculate the mean and the median. They won't give you a data set and say, hey, what do you think you should calculate, the mean or the median? I'm going to tell you how to do it, by the way, which one to use. So make sure you write this down, especially if you've never done this before. Well, we still have 3 steps. Step number 1 is we put the numbers from least to greatest. Step number 2 is we're going to use a procedure. I'll show it to you in a second. But the step is you just find the middle number. You're like, well, how do you do that? I'll show you the step. Step number 3 is if there is no middle number, it can happen. Then you take the 2 middle numbers and you find their average. That might not make sense, but it will after we do a couple of examples. 3 steps for calculating the median. 3 steps for calculating the median. All right, we good? We got it written down?
Yep.
All right, let's see an example. So I have a data set, bunch of numbers. Step number 1, if we're calculating the median, is I put the numbers from least to greatest. So this one takes the longest time. Now I will warn you, as you're doing this process, here's how I would do it. Find the smallest number, cross it out, write it. Find the next number, cross it out, write it. If there are repeats here, well, you write your repeats. There's only 1 10, but there are 2 11s. This way you don't skip a number. At the very end, count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Count so you don't skip a number because it's a pretty common thing that, or a mistake, I should say. If you do make a mistake, is you simply left off a number by accident. Okay, once that's done, we go to step number 2. Step number 2 is you find the middle number. Here we go. There, do you remember doing medians ever before? Okay, let me show you how it's done. So the process is this. You are going to, not to the original data set, to the new data set, you're going to cross off the smallest number. You're going to cross off the biggest number. You're going to cross off the smallest number. You're going to cross off the biggest number. You're going to continue this process of crossing the smallest and the biggest, the smallest and the biggest, until you're left with one number. And ladies and gentlemen, guess what? That's the answer. It's that simple. Finding the median is ridiculously easy. So the median is, why are you not clicking? The median is, still not clicking. There it is. Median is 11. All right, median is 11. Well, that wasn't hard at all. In fact, that was pretty easy. And yes, the median is an easy process. All right, let's see that again. Data set. Step number 1, put the numbers from least to greatest, least to greatest. As you do this process, I would recommend as you write down a number, cross it off from the original data set. As you write a number, cross it off. As you write a number, cross it off. And that way, at the very end, you make sure you've done all the numbers and then you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are 8. So I didn't skip one. Now, we cross off the smallest, cross off the biggest, cross off the smallest, cross out the biggest, cross off the smallest, cross, and now we have a problem. Notice, the previous one, we were left with one number, and now we're left with 2 numbers. These are the 2 things that can happen. You're either going to be left with one number, it's the answer, or you're going to be left with 2 numbers. And it just depends whether you have an odd or an even number of numbers in your data set. If you have an odd number of numbers, you're going to be left with 1 when you cross everything out. If you have an even number of numbers, like in this case, then you're going to be left with 2 numbers. When you're left with 2 numbers, you take the 2 numbers add them together, and divide by 2. Once again, if you're left with one number, it's the answer. If you're left with two numbers, once you cross off smallest and biggest, then take those two numbers that you're left with, add them together, and divide by 2. 11 plus 13 is 24. 24 divided by 2 is 12. If you're left with one number, it's the answer. If you're left with two numbers, add them together, divide by 2. Now, why does this work? Why does this help it when we have one of those weird numbers? Well, think about the process. The very first thing we do after we write them from least to greatest is we cross off the biggest and we cross off the smallest. Remember the weird number in the case of our house prices was a very, very, very large number. It was 6 million. Well, guess what? 6 million, you're dead to me. I already crossed you out. Right? It's out of the answer possibilities. And that's why the median is helpful if you have either very small numbers or very big numbers that are very different. If you got a lot of small numbers or a lot of big numbers, well, then that you can just deal with it. You can still do the mean. But if you only have one really tiny number or one really large number, then the median will tell you a more accurate indicator of your grades or of your center of your data. I'm thinking grades because the example I gave you before, when you have one really bad grade and a bunch of good grades, well, we probably should be calculating the median, not the mean. That's a better indicator of your performance in class. All right, so let's do one. How much am I doing on time? Oh, I'm doing swell. We got 10 minutes left. All right, to calculate the median, step number one, we take the numbers and we write them from least to greatest. So as I do this, I'm crossing out the smallest number is 14. I write 14. Next number, biggest one is 18. I write 18, cross it out. The next number is 23. I write 23, cross it out. Then 25, then 28. I have them from least to greatest. Step number two, cross off the smallest, cross off the biggest. Cross off the smallest, cross out the biggest. Look, Merry Christmas, there's only one number left. If there had been two numbers left, you'd add those two numbers and divide by 2. Since there's only one number left, life is good. 23 is your answer. Easy. Medians are fun and they're easy to do as well too. No one should make a mistake on medians. Average is hard. A lot of math involved. Or I should say mean. A lot of math involved. Easy to make a mistake. Medians, right? If you follow the procedures, you should not make a mistake. You should not make a mistake. Maybe one more. Here's when we have even number of numbers. All right, for those of you who are not watching it live, maybe you play the video while you're doing your homework to remind you of what to do. Write the numbers from least to greatest. So it will be what? 7, 11, 19, 22, 38, 45. Step number 2, cross things out. Cross off the smallest, cross off the biggest. Cross out the smallest, cross out the biggest. Oh, we're left with 2 numbers. When you're left with 2 numbers, take those 2 numbers. Remember the 2 middle numbers right here. Find their average. In other words, add them up and divide by 2. Add them up and divide by 2. When there's only one number, life is grand. It's the answer. But when there are 2 numbers, okay, one extra step. Add them up, divide by 2. 19 and 22 is 41, and 41 divided by 2 is 20.5. So where do the mistakes occur? Like I said, generally speaking, the mistakes occur is simply writing the numbers from least to greatest, this step right here. How do you prevent yourself from making a mistake? Cross out from the original data set the numbers as you write them from least to greatest. So that way, when you make a mistake, you can immediately see, oh, look, I didn't put them in order from least to greatest. Second mistake is you just simply leave a number out, even though you were careful, or cross things out. Count the numbers as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those are the most common mistakes. All right, questions on calculating the median. Now, I did have one with negative numbers. It doesn't change. Just remember when you write them from least to greatest that the -6 is smaller. Why is there 2 commas right here? Have I skipped a number? Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No, I just have an extra comma. All right, so when there's negative, -6 is smaller than -4. Cross out the smallest, cross out the biggest, cross out the smallest, cross out the biggest, cross out the smallest. Oh, Merry Christmas, we're only left with one number. We like that one. Therefore, the median is 1. The median is 1. There we go. All right, final call. Questions on calculating the median?
I have a question.
Sure.
So do we have to write 1 as 0, 1, or can we just write
It's up to
1?
you. Entirely up to you.
Okay.
Entirely up to you. Okay, so I said today we were only doing median and mean and median. On Monday, we'll include mode and range. Those are their other ones. Mode is a measure of central tendency. Range is not, by the way, but we'll describe that on Monday. So even though the homework tonight will say calculate the mean, median, mode, and range, I only want you to do the mean and the median. All right, we finally reached the end of quarantine. So the next time that we do math, it will be together face to face. I'm looking forward to that. You guys have a good weekend. If there are any questions, absolutely positively send to me. I didn't check the grades, and I did check last night. Those same people that did not take their test have still not taken their test, and it is a 0. Shame on you for not taking your test. Because you got a 0. And since we just calculated the mean, now you understand how that 0 is going to affect your overall grade. All right, start doing your work, people. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Looking forward to seeing you on Monday, and we'll see each other in 2 days. See you later.
See you later.